Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Are you and your team members fully trained on the accounting system or ERP as needed to perform your jobs? If you answered no or huh, how would you or your team do on a self-assessment? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 383. 30 system functionalities vendor team members should know, but they don't. So I'm not saying that they don't know all of them. All I am saying is that many of these functionalities within the accounting system or ERP, where your vendor master file is housed, where the vendor vendor records are added, where vendor records are maintained, existing vendors updated, the vendor master file cleaned, right? So there are things, and I know this from experience, so it's not to, fault anyone. It's just the nature of jobs, right? And so most of you know that I used to be a practitioner. I was an AP senior manager over global vendor setup and maintenance. I had a team of 17. We maintained 140,000 vendors across 7 different ERPs, and we processed 2,000 vendor requests per month. And I thought I just said 7 ERPs. And so not just one system, but 7. And I know a lot of you out there are dealing with multiple systems. And here's some things that I usually see either at the beginning of onboarding for a vendor team member, when I was a practitioner, all the way through to now working with teams as a consultant and kind of hearing what the team members are doing and why they are doing it. Related to the system. And so the first thing that I see is that there are always long-term employees or employees that have specified or specific knowledge around a certain either accounting system or functionality within that accounting system that really not a lot of other people understand. And there really should be a person that performs a position or a functionality or a job task, and another person that knows how to do it as part of like segregation of duties and being able to have that person go off on vacation and have the other person that knows it, that's cross-trained, do that or perform that function or job task as well. And that doesn't always happen. So you kind of have, and it kind of just depends on what it is. Sometimes I will tell you this, we always had DOS programs. It was like one that was left over from, I don't know, 1792. And it was one person that knew how to go in there that one time a month and get this report printed out or downloaded or whatever it was. But the problem with that is as soon as that person leaves, even if someone else has been trained, they haven't always done it, and they may not have been trained on the nuances. It wasn't necessarily documented. If it was documented, it wasn't updated. And so, not everyone knows that functionality. And so if something happens to that person, right, then that knowledge is gone. Uh, and then the next thing is, and this happens a lot when, especially now when I work with clients, is that they have the team members that are performing the vendor setup and maintenance job functions. They have desktop procedures, but that tell them what they need to do, but they actually don't know why they need to do it that way. It's just that they're doing it because that is the way that they were shown how to do it. And so when I come in and try to redesign their processes to plug up the gaps in their vendor onboarding process or vendor change process, it's kind of hard to identify what options are available if you don't know why you are doing something, like why you are, putting, I don't know, the address or the DBA in this field versus another field, why you're selecting that checkbox. And so I see that all the time. And that is something that is just inherent, and it doesn't mean anything. Well, it does mean something is wrong, but it's just inherent in the way that the tasks are transferred, right? Because the person that's leaving is either going to another position or leaving the company, retiring, whatever they're doing, and they're just trying to get somebody trained to get out of there. And yeah, I know we have longtime employees that want to make sure that the employees that are there taking their place, right, that are going to continue doing it, are doing it the right way. But isn't there always something lost? Because there's always something in that person who had been doing it forever, that was the SME on it, subject matter expert. It's always something that they didn't think to tell that they might have thought was right, intuitive. And so uh, that's always a thing as well. So whether or not you have documented procedures, there are still, right, some gaps in the process. And in some cases, you don't have that knowledgeable employee that for whatever reason didn't, transition all of their knowledge when they left. Maybe it's maybe it's a new system that you have and you just weren't fully trained, or maybe the person that did it before was gone and the person that came in maybe did it at another company, might even been the same type of or the same accounting system or ERP, except they're all configured differently. And so you run into issues even when you try to train, or you thought you hired somebody that was trained, or if you really didn't train everyone correctly, and you didn't get trained correctly and you still have questions, it just leads to, right, the dirty little secret. It probably is an open secret that there's things going on in the system that vendor team members should know, but they don't. So we're going to talk about 30 of them today. And you know what? This is probably going to be a longer podcast. And I started to break it up into two, but I have a self-assessment that has all of them included on it. And I wanted to be able to offer that with the first podcast. And if I did that, then you probably wouldn't listen to the second one because you would have them all. So I am just going to go through these. Hopefully it won't be so long and I won't have that much commentary on each one. But for each of these, I have seen where, or might even have a story, right, where the vendor teams not having this information really caused some issues. So we're just going to go ahead and get started with number one. Now, I will say that in this podcast, I've divided these into just two: vendor adds and changes, and then maintaining the vendor master file. But on the self-assessment checklist, which I will have a link to it in the show notes, it is divided into much more categories, or many more categories, to make it easier for you to do that self-assessment and understand where your team, what area your team may be lacking some training in. And so just keep that in mind. All right, so this first one, the first category of the two is vendor adds and changes, and there are 16 of the 30. So the first two are really surrounding how to know how to set the vendor up in the system, like how to categorize them, how to separate them from other vendors. And so if you have a system like SAP, or other similar systems, you may have company codes, business unit assignments, right? And so the team needs to know how to assign vendors to the correct entities, locations, or business units within the system. Now, number two is vendor classification fields. Now, depending on your accounting system or ERP, you could have both one and two, like company codes and also vendor classification fields, or your vendor classification fields can act like company codes or business unit assignments. But with that, they have to know, again, how to assign the vendor type, vendor group, pay group, business unit, or other categories that are used for processing and reporting. And both of those are very important too, because sometimes if you have like vendor inactivation that's automated in your system, you can separate, or you can identify which business groups to include or exclude, or company codes or classification, whatever it is in your system, which means that you can isolate certain vendor types that you do not want to include in the inactivation. And by the way, that is one of the biggest complaints or pushbacks that I get for inactivating vendor records. It's because they don't want to inactivate all the vendor records. For example, sometimes you might have bid vendors in your system, and so you don't want to inactivate those. Well, that means that your team members have to know that they need to classify or identify that vendor as for example, bid vendor. All right. So the next one, and these are kind of in order of vendor adds and changes, like what you would do before, you set the vendor up. And definitely they need to know the vendor search functionality. So how to search for existing vendors before creating a new one, even right. And changing an existing vendor, because the whole point of this is to make sure the vendor's not already in the system, or if it is an existing vendor change, to make sure that you are updating or you search for and select the right vendor. So you do need to know like what's included in the vendor search results, what to search for. Sometimes you guys have short names and you can search by that, but the vendor search functionality, they need to know how to search for that vendor. And sometimes that can be, a little different depending on your configuration and your accounting system or ERP that you have. Okay, so the next one is the vendor record creation. So how to create a new vendor record in the system and to complete required fields. Let me tell you, when I work with clients to help them plug up the gaps, redesign their vendor process, one of the first things that I ask for is all the required fields that the system requires. And many times I will get a list of the required fields that they require, whether they required in the system or not. And so what I'm looking looking for is what fields are required by the system and what fields need to be required by the system. So make sure that you have that information and that they know that information. And you would know if they didn't know, because if they didn't put in all the fields that were required, they wouldn't be able to create the record. The next one is the vendor edit. So how to edit a vendor record. So how to update existing vendor records correctly without overwriting like critical data, because there's some things that may not need to be updated just because an address is being updated. And speaking of addresses, the next two, 6 and 7, are based on that. So 6 is address management, how to maintain multiple addresses and understand which address is used for payment, purchase orders, or tax reporting. So however you identify an address as a remit to address, as a purchase order address, whatever addresses you have, they need to know how to identify those addresses correctly, how to maintain multiple addresses, how to enter those addresses. And then remit to address maintenance, how to add, update, or select remit to addresses separately from legal or ordering addresses, because that can have an effect, especially if you have a check payment. Or depending on your systems like PeopleSoft, right, have a remit address or has an address that could be tied to a location field. And so if you still have that location that is the banking payment, then you cannot inactivate that address, and that address needs to remain valid, especially if you have follow the template that I have for bank account setup for vendor banking collection, I should say, because that ties the remit address, that asks for the remit address, which can tie to that location. And I do that for that reason, because there are systems like PeopleSoft where you can make sure you're updating the right location, because you can make sure you're updating or you're grabbing the right remittance address. And then next, with vendor adds and changes, number 8 is contact information maintenance. So how to add and update vendor contacts while knowing which contacts are informational versus payment related. So do you have a way to tell which contacts need to be the ones that are called when you're doing that confirmation call versus the contact that I don't know, your purchasing team member may contact, or your internal team member that has a relationship with the vendor, right? They may have a salesperson. So the other thing too is sometimes contact information is used for automated purchase orders. So the vendor team needs to know how to identify a contact correctly in the vendor master file. And then number 9 is currency and payment format setup. So how to maintain currency, country, and payment format settings for domestic and international vendors. And that can get a bit complex, since some of you will do different things for international vendors. Maybe you are sending that information to another source to complete that payment. You're just putting it in a pay file, right? And they're asking for specific information. So the vendor team needs to know how to set that up correctly for however it is you are getting those payments to your vendors. And that brings up the next one too. Number 10 is payment method setup. So how to assign or update payment methods such as ACH, wire, check, or virtual card. And that can even be in situations where you have, or the vendor has sold their receivables, right? They need to know how to set that up so that the payment for that vendor is still recorded as income for the vendor, but the payment itself will go to the third party factoring organization, if I said that right. The next one is bank account maintenance. If you still maintain the vendor's bank account in your accounting system or ERP, right in your vendor master file, and I am seeing more and more where many vendor teams are not, which I'm happy about because it's a pain in the behind to have to worry about whether or not that bank change you did was fraudulent or not. If you don't maintain it in your vendor master file, then you don't have to worry about that either. But if you do, they need to know, the vendor team needs to know how to enter and change bank account details, and including knowing which fields drive payment processing. And I will tell you on this one, when I first started that position where I had the 7 ERPs, it was very confusing trying to identify how to set that vendor record up for to generate, I should say, a remittance advice. I know what they told me that field was supposed to do, but it just didn't make any sense that just because in that field I put an email address somehow when it got to the bank where at that point, I didn't even know whether the pay file included the email address for the remittance. It was just confusing to me how that resulted in a remittance advice to the vendor. So if you're scratching your head just like I was, you might want to find that out. Or if you think your team members are scratching their heads about that or don't know, you might want to make sure they're trained on that. All right, the next one is terms maintenance. So this is payment terms, and this can be very important because the vendors don't get paid on time. The day after was supposed to be paid, somebody's going to get a call, so you want to keep those calls down. So they need to know how to assign and update payment terms correctly, so invoices pay according to policy. Also, you want to make sure that if payment terms change, that the default payment terms, whatever that is in your system, if it allows default payment terms, are updated as well, and people know where to go to update those default payment terms. The next one, let's talk about tax field maintenance. Now, this is very important, how to enter and maintain the tax ID, where that should go, how to identify the tax classification, because that can drive whether or not the vendor is reportable, what the withholding indicators are, and just really any 1099 related fields. And so often I just see this is where that goes, this is where this goes, this is where this goes. There's no understanding about what that means in the system, what it does, how it generates. Um, whether it generates a 1099, what field it generates it in. And you know what else? And has not any, well, maybe it does. I was going to say it doesn't have anything to do with this list, but I still see in folks' system where the 1099 MISC box 7 is still labeled that way in the description in that field in the accounting system or ERP. But when it generates it, it still generates it. I mean, it generates it on the right 1099 NEC, the right form, but it's still described a different way. Still has that old description on it. All right, the two more for vendor adds and changes. So number 14, I guess three more. Number 14 is document attachment functionality. So how to attach W-9s, bank letters, onboarding forms, validation, support. So when you do your vendor validations, you should be taking screenshots of those. Your team should be doing that. And so how to attach all that to the vendor record. And another thing you might want to ask too is who can see it. So how to attach it and who can see it. And if you're not attaching it, then how to make sure they know how to or where to download it securely, and then who has access to that. The next one can be very important, but I see a lot of people miss this one. Number 15 is the notes and the comments field usage. So, how to document review steps, exceptions, validations, results in the system. So, I always recommend that you add comments to all vendor record adds, vendor record changes. Say what you did, say why you did it, say who did it. This can be help for the auditing staff if they're coming in and auditing, don't really understand why something was done. And so, it just helps to explain the what was added and what was changed on the vendor record. And so, what I usually find is that sometimes, or actually most times, comments are not added, and then some systems have multiple comment areas or multiple areas or fields where you can put notes. And it's just inconsistent how those notes or which fields those notes are entered in. And so make sure you understand that functionality and then pick one. And then standardize the comments and the notes that are entered. And then the last one in the vendor adds and changes section is number 16, and that is workflow submission and approval routing. So if you have a system with that, when you set up vendor setup or vendor records or change existing vendor records, there is a workflow attached to it where it's going to be sent to someone else to review and approve it. Then the team member needs to know how that works, when it is triggered, what happens when they reject it, and what needs to be done in order to send it back for approval. So, all the things, how to submit a vendor setup or change request into the workflow, and then track where it is in the approval process. And then if it's rejected, how to fix it and then send it back again. All right, so that was number 16. And so that was it for the vendor adds and changes. And now we're going to talk about maintaining the vendor master file, and that's going to be 14. So starting with number 17 of 30. And again, this is maintaining the vendor master file. So these are things that are just kind of system related. So the first one is status field interpretation. So they need to know and understand statuses like pending, active, inactive, blocked, rejected, or under review. And if you are in SAP, they need to know what is that, whether it is a company code block, or what is the other term, central block or purchasing block. So they need to know what that means to the vendor record, what the vendor record can or cannot do based on the status of that vendor record. And then the number 18 is vendor inactivation and blocking. So they need to know how to inactivate, how to block, how to place a hold, right, on a vendor record, and when it should no longer be used. And so if you have something like a payment to, an ACH payment that was just returned, you don't want to send another payment out because, some of those vendors get payments multiple times very quickly. And so they might be in the next pay cycle. And so you want to make sure you block them so you don't have yet another payment that is going to be returned. And so they need to know how to block, how to place a hold, how to inactivate, and then also when it should no longer be used. So when you update the banking information, then that block should be removed so that they can have so that the payment can be sent. And then the next two are related to duplicates. So, are there any duplicate check tools? So, how to check the system or how the system uses features that help them identify duplicate names, tax IDs, addresses, or bank accounts if you have that. Know what the system is looking at. I had a recent client that said, well, our system will flag duplicates, but really the system flagged duplicates based on the name and the tax ID, but they should probably also be looking at addresses as well. Because if someone fat fingers the address or fat fingers the tax ID or the legal name now you have another field that you can search to see if there are duplicates, meaning there are more than one address, same address for different vendor records. Now, sometimes, depending on your system, you do have different vendor records for different addresses because that's just how the system is. But many systems don't have that issue. You can have different addresses or multiple addresses on one vendor record, so that's not an issue. And so if you see that same address on a different vendor record, you know what? That vendor might be a duplicate. Now, again, I've worked with clients that will say, the system will flag duplicates, but it wasn't until we looked at the configuration that they saw exactly what the system was looking at. And in one case, it was only looking at the vendor legal name and not the tax ID as well. And so you really need to make sure that the team knows what that is. And for a lot of these things, you might have to get with IT to make sure you get the documentation of the configuration of your system. Because sometimes, even if you go online and you look at the base configuration, your particular system may have been customized. All right. And so duplicate check tools. Okay. So that was number 19. And number 20 is kind of the same thing, but different. So if you find duplicates, then you need to know if your system, right, how it works, if you have a vendor merge or a consolidation tool. So if the system handles like the duplicate cleanup, if a merge functionality exists, make sure you know or your team knows how that functionality first off is if it exists. If it does, is very good. I've never if my systems had that, I probably didn't know it. I would have been doing the same self-assessment. But if it did do it, I probably would have known because we were always looking for duplicates. But if that functionality does exist, it's great. Just make sure you know how it works. And then also, number 21 is the required field validation. So know how the system flags missing mandatory fields and what must be done before saving. This one probably should have been on the vendor adds and changes. But you do need to know, right, what must be completed before saving. It might not be as simple as, well, you know what, put some information in that field. It could be the fact that it's based on other fields that's triggering that field to be required. So make sure your team understands that. And then number 22 is role-based access permission awareness. So knowing what actions the user can and cannot perform, and when another role must approve or complete the step. And this is just really understanding what roles have access to the vendor setup or to the vendor master file, what they can do, can they add, can they edit, and it could be what screens can they add or edit. And I tell this story all the time. You may not have heard it. I tell it a lot in person when I'm at in-person conferences doing presentations, but I was 2 years into that position with the 7 ERPs and all those vendors. Until I found out that the purchasing team had access to edit the contact information screen in the vendor master file, one of the vendor master files on one of the systems. And that is because they had an automated purchase order process, and they didn't want to delay sending purchase orders because they were waiting on, the vendor team to update the fax number it needed to go to or the email address it needed to go to. I absolutely did away with that. I did give them a streamlined process to get that information updated. But we definitely don't want to have anyone having update access in the vendor master file that absolutely does not need it, especially with contacts, because those contacts, right? I didn't want them messing with contacts that we would use or have to use to confirm like remittance changes. So make sure you are aware of that. And I usually recommend you do a security role audit in that process or in that scenario, actually in all scenarios. And I think I have a webinar where I talk about how to implement that. I will put that in a link to it in the show notes. It's at this point it's on a recording, but it's still great information. So I'll put that in the show notes. And then the next one is the audit trail change log review. So you do need to know how to view who created or changed the vendor record, what changed, when it changed. You really need to know what fields the audit table is collecting. And you need to know if they're collecting the before and after. Some do and some don't. And as far as knowing what fields the audit table stores or collects, right, that's not something that's always like taught. That's not something that's always transitioned. So, especially if you inherited a vendor master file, then you want to take a look at the audit table and see what fields it's capturing. You might need to capture more. The only reason I knew that is because we implemented a vendor self registration portal, and that portal generated its own vendor ID. And we wanted to put that vendor ID, we had to add a field to the accounting systems that were in scope. So we had to add a field for the portal vendor ID. And then we wanted that vendor ID to be captured on the audit table. And so when we got the audit table, we were like, well, that's all the fields it's capturing. So you should ask for that. You should review it and make sure it's capturing all the fields you want it to capture and that it is capturing before and after. And if you don't have it set up, if it's possible, make sure you set it up. And then, so that was number 23. And number 24 is the approval history review. So, how to confirm the required approvals were completed for setup or change requests. This can be like a part of the audit process. And the next one is payment hold and stop flags. So, I kind of talked about this one before, but it is separate, right? How to place or remove holds that prevent payments from being issued, or right payments that allow payments to be issued. The next one is 26, reporting functionality, how to run or review reports for new vendors, recent changes, duplicates, missing tax data, and inactive vendors. And this could be a report, it could be a query, whatever it's called for the system. But that's something that's really needed if you right clean your vendor master file, because I always recommend that you clean that at least monthly. Or quarterly, or twice a year, and then at the very least annually. And or in order to do that, you have to extract that information from your vendor master file. So the team needs to know how to get that information. I also recommend that you just verify you know all of the international vendors or countries that your vendors exist in, not just kind of depend on what countries, right, what it says on the vendor master file. Actually look at it. So pull, the vendor ID, the country, the state, the city, and take a look at some states that have like inaccurate 2-digit or 3-digit abbreviations. So you might see IR or IRL or GB or GBP, right? And that just means that, whoever entered that vendor record in did not know how to enter in international countries, because the country could say US or it could be blank. And then you have that situation going on. So in order to do those kinds of reviews, like the inactivation or clean up the vendor master file project, if it's all manual, or just seeing what countries your vendors are in so you can make sure you have all the correct validations, you have to be able to generate reports or queries out of the system. And then number 27, this is a good one. This is error message interpretation. So, how to read and resolve system edits, warnings, and hard stop messages during setup or maintenance. Sometimes you get those messages, you didn't even know the messages were a thing, like have never seen this message before. And so make sure the team knows what to do when they get those messages, what those messages could be, and then what to do when they get the messages. And then three more. So, number 28 is import interface awareness. This is a big one that you might not think is a big one, or those of you that know, you know it's a big one. So, they need to know whether vendor data comes from manual entry, portal, um, integration, upload, how that affects the review, right? And so sometimes you get, let's say, invoices in electronically on EDI. I think it's 850 files, or is it 950? I think it's 850 files, right? And so when that comes in, it's going to look at like specific fields on the vendor master file or the vendor record. And if you don't have the right information in that field, then that whole file is going to fail, or, that record is going to fail. And so, and nowadays, many systems are API'd or interfaced with so many other systems that if you make a incorrect change to a field, that it's looking for. Maybe you remove information from a field that is required for that file to be valid or to not error out, right? It's going to error out. And so they need to know like what those import interfaces are that affect or that are affected by what is entered on the vendor record. And then number 29 is self-service portal integration. So this one is kind of like the import interface, right? Because self-service portal integration, that could be by batch file, that can be by API, and the same would apply. But if you have one, knowing how the vendor submitted data flows into the accounting system, right, for review or approval, or just flows into the accounting system because the review or approval is in the portal itself. I will tell you that when we implemented the portal, we really didn't have that problem because we didn't have the time, or it was just too much effort to do the integration. And so we did what was called swivel chair, which means that we just took whatever was in the self registration portal and entered it into the vendor master file like we had using the method beforehand. And by the way, it was still a more efficient process. So with those 7 ERPs, instead of having 7 ways to get that data in, we had just one way. Actually, only 5 of them were in scope, but still, it still consolidated how we got information in. All right. And then the last one is security sensitive field recognition. So knowing which fields are high risk. Now, I always say there are at least 3 pieces of sensitive data on the vendor record. That is the tax ID, because the tax ID could be the social security number, not just because of that. If you're using it to make sure that the vendor is who they say they are, like if that is one of your identification questions or authentication questions, which is what I call it, then that should be sensitive. Definitely the bank account. If you are storing banking details for ACH or wire payments. And then, if for whatever reason you are collecting a date of birth, sometimes it's required by the IRS for non US vendors or foreign payees. And sometimes it's required by other countries as well. But you can identify what is considered, or what your company considers sensitive information, and then understand what those are, so that when they see that field mask or whatever is being done with that field, to make sure that folks that don't need to see the full field or don't need to see the field at all, that it is not revealed. And so if they see a field that is masked, they know why. If an internal team member contacts them and says that they can't see the tax ID, they will know why. And so make sure that information is documented. All right. So as I said, this is a longer podcast, but I was able to get through the 30. Again, I will put links in the show notes to the vendor setup system functionality checklist. I think I renamed it because I always name things so long, but I will put that in the show notes. It's a self-assessment, and so you can see where you and your team are. I will also put a link in the show notes for the security audit. I think it's a 30-minute webinar, 5 steps. I don't know. I will put that in the show notes. It's a recording. You can watch it anytime that is convenient for you. And I think that's all that I had or talked about putting in the show notes for you. If I missed anything, feel free to reach out to me and I will add it. But I'll try to I'll listen to it again and see if there's anything that I missed. So, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 383rd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.